a year. When you have battleground states and non-battleground states, that absolutely skews the political debate and policy decisions. Because you make policy decisions for one state that's going to move the election rather than making it for the country. And to me, there's a perfect example of the kind of dysfunction that happens when you don't have a popular vote, and somebody's vote in one state is more important than somebody's vote in another state, which is the reason I support this, the general direction you guys are heading. So.
Can I make a comment? Sure. I just thought it was a good point that Paul made. And as we go through this and we discuss the importance of being or not being a battleground state in the context of the national popular vote or whatever, I think it's what Paul raised was interesting is the effect that it has on the down ballot. Okay, so I think that's something that we need to keep in the back of our mind. The other thing that, as we talk about policy at the national level or at the state level or whatever, that I fear that if you place too much emphasis on this idea that being a battleground state is the only thing that governs policy, that you're misled. Because, in fact, in my opinion, a lot of it has to do with the seniority of your elected representatives, which are elected, as you pointed out, by popular vote. You know, we lost Senator Domenici here. How that probably has a greater impact on the state of New Mexico and the benefits they may or may not receive than whether or not we elect a president by national popular vote. So when you talk about battleground state, in my opinion, I think you need to realize that that's not the only issue that the benefit or non-benefit of attention by the federal Congress is. It may be more influenced by the seniority of your members than it is by how you voted in the presidential. That's just my opinion.
No, but I think that brings up a bigger, perhaps important point, which was states are clearly represented by the Senate. You know, I mean, states are clearly represented. We have representation of states. You know, and from sort of thinking, and this is the point I sort of want to end with, so I don't want to come back. I want to come back to this, and I don't want to go into a lot here. But I think that this important point is where should representation occur? You know, we have a lot of representation of states. Should we consider, you know, representation at a national level? And I do want to come, because I agree with you. States get a lot of representation in the Senate. The Senate has huge power. All senators have.
I'm sorry, we didn't touch on Pennsylvania.
Oh, right, I forgot. Thank you for reminding me. I totally forgot. I handed out that stuff and we got into a discussion and I forgot. Okay, so I've handed out sort of three things. The first one was something that Alan Brumowitz, he's a professor at Emory in Georgia, and he has these lists of toss-up states, and this is on a blog, and he just points out how, so his thing is, the Democrats should keep the Electoral College because it's going to be really good for them this year. So the idea that we should think about a national popular vote, and the fact that Democrats are supportive of the national popular vote, he says, is in terms of thinking about this election, he thinks that the numbers look really good for Obama. So that's this swing one, this one that has the picture of the book. The interesting thing that's going on right now, there are two states, Pennsylvania and Nebraska, that are reconsidering how they allocate their votes. And so Nebraska is the one of two states, Nebraska and Maine, that allocate their electoral college votes by district. So that means that each congressional district gets an electoral vote, and then the state, whoever wins the state, gets 2 votes, right? Because that's, so they do it by district and then by state for the 2 senators. So in 2008, that one district around Omaha was actually won by Obama. So Nebraska split their electoral college votes, giving that however many, 3 or 4 to McCain and 1 to Obama. And Obama spent a lot of money in Nebraska. He went after that one electoral college vote because it was so close. So Nebraska is, though, a Republican state, generally speaking, and so the Republican legislature is considering altering their plan and eliminating their district plan and moving to a winner-take-all system. Pennsylvania, also controlled currently by Republicans, but they have these large urban areas that make it attractive to Democrats, and where they can turn out a lot of the vote and win the state. And so they're thinking of moving from a winner-take-all system to an electoral, a district-based system. And that's what it is. And I thought I had, George Will actually had an article too, where he said, this is a really bad idea. It could end up costing Republicans the election if Pennsylvania does that. So he sort of made the opposite argument. But they're actually weighing whether or not they should change their thing, because they think that will benefit the Republican candidate over the Democratic candidate. But, you know, like George Will points out, I think it's hard to know how that'll come out. So, you know, states do think about this process, right, which is their right, is certainly their right under the Constitution in terms of manipulating the process to advantage their own particular candidate. And if it's a really close race, it could be that dividing the electoral college votes for Pennsylvania, which has like 20, I think they have 20 electoral college votes, 21 electoral college votes. You know, they might be able to change the outcome of the election in a close context. So I think that's, I mean, I just like to get, what do you think of, what's people's reactions to that? Is there any thoughts on that? Or, yeah, Paul.
One reaction I want is that it seems to me the Pennsylvania and Nebraska examples suggest that states electors anyway, are paying more attention to voting in who the best president is in general, rather than who the best president is for their state per se. I think it's going that way. I'm throwing it out as a possibility, because you know they're not looking at it. Well, enough said. I throw that out as a possibility. That
So you mean the partisan nature? They're looking at it from a partisan perspective as opposed to a state voter perspective, or?
The way they're gaming the system, they're looking at it to benefit their party, not their state. Maybe that's a better way of saying it.
Yeah. You know, parties are about winning and losing.
To me, it points out a problem with the compact, in that,
Okay.
well, you've got legislators that are considering, okay, we know the states have the authority under the Constitution to determine the way their states cast their electoral vote. And the theory of the compact is that states would enter into an agreement to do so in a particular manner. But, as we all know, legislatures change in states, and states change with those inherent changes. And so to me, it points out a flaw in the compact in that people could come in and out of this compact and create an instability there in the overall process.
You know, it is very clear states could move out of that process. So yeah, I mean, states could say, no, I don't want to be part of this process anymore. And it, you know, I mean, if we're talking about gaming, then, you know, they might be more likely to do that if the race looks very close.
Right.
If the race looks very close or something. They do have to do it within certain times, so that information may not be available for them to do that. I can't remember the exact number of days that they had, that there's so many, 6 months before.
Have to do it by June.
But,
Yeah,
but
so.
as we discussed before, in theory, you could have a compact in effect that elects the winner of the national popular vote during one cycle. States move out of that because they didn't like the end result of that. And in the next cycle, the same candidate's running, elected under a different system. And to me, that creates an instability there.
Well, but I mean, look at what Pennsylvania and Nebraska are doing now. I mean,
Is that
there's
still a
inherent
possibility,
instability, because I think constitutionally, that's what they were looking at doing.
Right.
States you decide. I mean, I was just showing Paul a quote from Thomas Jefferson dating to 1798, 1802, somewhere in there, where he was lamenting the fact that Virginia was a districted state, and by God, he wanted that change. I think he was talking to Madison. He wanted that change for the next election cycle because he was running, and he wanted all of Virginia's electoral votes.
Right.
So I mean, it's when you talk about it being unstable, there's a distinction. What you're talking about is the compact being unstable,
Right.
which is correct. It is unstable. But then if you look at how the Electoral College works at the state level anyway, it's unstable because they can change it.
States
Right.
could change how.
Yeah, I mean, it was looking at
But the
Colorado.
procedure is not as
Except-
unstable. It's unlikely that how a state casts its vote articulate that. It doesn't, while one state may change how they cast their electoral votes, it won't have the impact that it would if they were a member of a compact with as few as 10 other states, in my opinion. I mean, I see what you're saying, there's an element of change there no matter what. But you're, in the election process itself, you have an understanding how a state's going to cast its vote is more so stable under this process than it would be under a compact process, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think, it's hard to say. I mean, there's a lot of, I guess there could be enthusiasm for change after that, but, legislators are sort of busy with things, and I don't know, I wonder about that. Would they really be most responsive to that process? Would they really be, there's a lot of inertia associated with the process of changing it, and so it's, they have voted. So I think that's, once you change,
I need a little clarification around this discussion. Does this mean that the proposal that's been passed by a number of states allows them to change?
they could pull out of the compact.
They could pull out, I didn't realize that, okay.
Oh, yeah.
I hadn't really
Well
read it well
in
enough.
advance of an election.
Yeah,
Yes.
not
And-
quickly.
You can't stick your finger in the chocolate and decide you
Yeah.
like it.
Well, right, I mean, it gets back to the
Exactly.
Colorado example that Lana had, which was, it was quickly put on the ballot, and then it was gonna be retroactively effective.
Thank you.
So they don't want that kind of really rapid, let's change the way we're doing it. And I think this instability, this change, the decision to change it, I mean, based on what we're seeing and what we're hearing on this, it's almost driven exclusively by meeting political ends. Which party, the only reason that it's even being considered, I think, in Nebraska and in Pennsylvania is because the individuals who are in power
Benefit from one another.
are going to be the ones that could benefit from those totally opposite changes. And that's not to say that it wouldn't happen, somewhere else it wouldn't
And
happen.
that's my point, though, if you have a compact of 11, as few as 11 states, where's the balance of power there? You know what I'm saying? I mean, do they then become sort of battleground states if they should want to change their, whether they are in or out of a compact?
They
No.
wouldn't be,
No.
because
The opposite is
well, but it's not what happens within their state that matters, it's what happens
National.
But, okay, for instance, if Mexico enters into a compact and they agree to cast their votes, their electoral vote for the national popular vote winner, regardless of who was the popular vote in Mexico. And then there was a repercussion as people all of a sudden wake up to the idea, oh, electoral college. And the citizens of New Mexico say, but we voted for this gentleman. And in the past, when we did that, this is what happened. And so then they become upset because they're no longer a battleground state or whatever. And they go to their legislature and say, okay, we want you to pull out of this compact. We don't like it. I mean, to me, that's just, I understand that each state can do that now individually in a sense. They can change how they cast their vote. But that's 1 of 50 versus 1 of 11, as few as 11. I'm probably not making that clear, but
I'm following what you're saying.
I just wonder if people within this, by creating a compact, that those states sort of develop an undue influence.
I mean, I think it's interesting, it's very hard to know because we're having a lot of assumptions
Theory,
about what
right.
might happen.
Right.
I mean, but, I can imagine that if you had a compact in place, that other states would just join. And, that there would be some momentum at that point. Not all the states, but there would be some momentum for states to join
your
that
opposite.
process. You don't think so? Well, I mean, why is it then, I mean, I guess because their votes have now, because of how their votes
Well, I
are
think
expressed
there's
differently.
just so
And there's
many
so much
factors.
public support. There's so much public support.
You yourself have pointed out the public doesn't understand the process.
But what would they, okay, so I can
Then you
imagine-
change the
so I
process
think
and they
that
might
the
go,
only-
wow.
That they have so much allegiance to their state as opposed to their nation?
No, not necessarily.
Because
I'm just
that's
saying that
the-
they might,
No, they could.
Just to chime in, being part of the process, it will get gamed to the max for every state that sees any way to work it. And we'll have strategists looking at it up and down, left and right,
Okay.
So however it can be manipulated, it will be manipulated, that's how public policy works. So,
And that was the point I made in a
So,
prior
you know, I
meeting.
think that's a
You may
very
be just
valid-
creating a different battleground state.
I think it's a very valid concern.
You might be a different battleground state, but yeah, we're gonna talk about the competition, because I think it's important.
Somebody last time said, although 72% of the public may support popular vote, they're asked that in a survey where they have like 30 seconds to make a decision. If you give them the full range of issues regarding the electoral college and impacts, that 72% isn't there anymore. I don't know what it is, but they said if the public is informed, rather than 30 seconds on a survey question, that they may come to a different decision. So I'm not sure what that 72% means.
There's a lot of underlying assumptions in that process. I agree that the public doesn't probably know the process, but I also would say that the public has, I would guess that the public in their gut thinks that the person who should be president should be elected by the most votes. And I think that's a gut level issue for most people.
And
I think that's just right here. Gee, the person that wins should get the most votes.
the two gentlemen
And
that
that's,
were here
you know,
last time representing the National Coalition Popular Vote, one of them who worked for Bush and worked on the Republican campaign said he was surprised when presented to the Democrats in general, they said, that sounds fair, let's do it. When presented to the Republicans that he talked to over here, said, what's in it for my party? I'm not sure I understand what either of them exactly.
right, and I think that for Republicans, it's a harder issue. I do, I think for Republicans, it's a harder issue. And we saw that change actually in public opinion for Republicans where they were a minority, you know, they said, no, we don't support that because they're working off the 2000 election. And so it's like, wait a minute, my party could lose. And so they have this frame in their head of the 2000 election.
Well, let me just take up for the Republican Party just a little bit here, because there is a little more. Thanks, Maggie. I'm just saying, if you go back to our very first meeting, and some of the comments that people make, is that this is a federalist system. And in your own Federalist Papers, there's a lot of sayings. You know, you put up Thomas Jefferson here every day, but I've read things of Thomas Jefferson that would be totally anti-national popular vote, as you say. So, you know, you can pick and choose your allegiance, but we are a Federalist system as designed. And so, again, I bring that up as a point.
Yeah, and we have a lot of federalism. I mean, the Senate represents all the states. I mean, that's a huge aspect. No one represents the nation. I think that's important to think about too, which is the contrast there, which is, you know, we have a president who, and so I think I do want to argue this point at this point because it's come twice, and we can come back to it at the end. So I think it's important to at least get on the table. I mean, we have no one represents the nation. No office represents the nation. We have lots of offices that represent states and districts. The House represents districts, the Senate represents states. The president is done by the states, but the president is the only national figure, the only national person, the only person that is embodied to represent the nation, right? That is the president's job, to represent the nation, not to represent particular states within the nation, but to represent the entire nation. But the way he's elected to office is not through that process. And we have federalism, and I support federalism. I think states should have rights. I think states should have power, and they do have power, and they do have representation. So I think one thing we should think about, and I don't want to say the answer to this. You know, obviously, I mean, I want us to have a discussion about it, but I think it's important to think about that tension between sort of what's happening with states and what's happening with voters, and you know, where should the president obtain his power and position? Should it be from the states? Maybe. Maybe it should be from the nation. I don't know.
Do you have any data that describes how elections would have been changed throughout history?
If we had the
national popular vote, how often it would have gone to the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party?
There's just 4 times.
Okay.
There's just 4 times. There's only 4 times. So the Electoral College mostly does a good
Hold
job.
on, I'm not sure that's what her question
That's not
was.
her question.
Are you referring to the 4 times that the loser of the popular vote actually became president.
Yes.
I think what you're talking about is, are you talking about that or how it affects the parties?
I guess, well, my question was just, you know, how many times throughout history would it have been reversed?
Before.
Yeah.
4 times.
And what, is there only 4 times, so not that
It's
substantial?
not for years. Yeah.
More than 10. 10%.
No, I think that we have now this system of, we're talking about accountability, and I get a credit card bill, and boy, my numbers are right there. They've really had this truth in lending that they're pushing for everything that you get in the mail, and you know exactly what your percentages are, and you know how this works, and blah, 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 blah. But so many people that vote, there's no truth in voting. Where you explain to me, and I can tell you I was uneducated a large part of my life. I became educated later in life. And when you tell people you have no constitutional right to elect the president, that's like, what? They don't know that. And they don't know. They may not understand. If you ask them, do you know what the Electoral College is? And they say, oh yeah, I know. They don't want to admit that they don't know. It's very embarrassing. And that, but if you explain to them, do you understand, you know, really in some bold print, somewhere on something, I think that you really, I think that the populace would say, what do you mean I'm not voting for the president directly? They still don't, they're not getting it, you know. So I do think that it's true that the populace in the U.S. wants to be able to vote directly. I would say that because
It's a Colbert moment.
because it shocked me. It shocked me when I became educated as an adult, when they explained it to me, and I had been voting all along, and I felt like I'd been duped. You know, like I've been duped. What do you mean I don't vote for my president? I really didn't have a clue. And so I think that it is. It's absolutely. They may not know what the Electoral College is, but they don't like the idea that they're not, their money's not going to their money, but their vote's not going to them directly. Just a little side step.
Yeah. Good point. So what is the effect of, what would be the effect, I mean, this is where I want to, more speculation, because I think we're concerned by unintended consequences. And as a political scientist, I can say that we care about rules and institutions pretty heavily, and so we're always studying how things change and then how that created all kinds of unintended consequences. I think how we elect, for example, the whole nomination system, the primary system is a good example of a lot of unintended consequences. And you know, we think today that has a lot to do with the polarization in Congress. And the polarization that seems to be happening at a public level as well. And that polarization has now moved down to the states, right? So it seems the party is like, well, if you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, then if you like that, I must not like that. And it used to not be that way in the states as much, right? And that used to not be that way in Congress as much, you know, so this polarization. And so that one potential unintended consequence of nomination campaigns, of having primaries, is that, you know, you carve out these districts that are very homogeneous, and then those people, you know, come from those districts. They have to go in a primary where people are very to the right or very to the left, and then they're representing those interests more than the middle, right? So those are unintended consequences are serious concerns. So what's the benefits and costs of voting under NPV? It seems like there's potentially a psychological significance and a potential down ballot, and I want to keep in mind Paul's, which is not on my slide, which is that they benefit from, I guess those are like RNC expenditures transfers, RNC transfers.
Yeah, national money coming.
But you still get the RCCC,
Yes.
RNCC, sorry, RNCC. Okay, so this is the turnout in 2008 data that I sent around to you. The average turnout, this is the voting eligible population. This is Michael McDonald's data at George Mason, and he takes out all the unqualified prison population, immigrant populations. There aren't a lot of those. These are all constant across all of the states. So turnout was pretty high in 2008 relative to, you know, say the 70s or 80s, 62%. And then Minnesota's just this incredible state. They just have incredible civic, whatever there. I don't know. Those people, I mean, they're really good. They always turn out to vote. They're very active. They have same-day registration, so they have a lot of mechanisms to ensure greater participation. So one question is, I mean, you notice that one thing it seems to me that as I looked at these data, where's New Mexico? We're sort of right at the mean. We're almost right at the mean. That's interesting. You know, we're often at the mean. We also have a mean number of women in legislators. We're a nice mean state, average state. So it's really interesting. Okay, so we're right at the mean here. One thing that seems interesting to me is that a lot of the states, right, including the big states, a lot of one-party states, Hawaii, Texas, Oklahoma, they have really low Utah. Utah's usually one of the lowest voter turnout states. Yeah, have really low turnout. And they have low turnout because it doesn't matter. Because if I'm both, it doesn't matter. I mean, I know we talked about this before. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. That they don't feel like they influence the election outcome. And that's true whether you're a Democrat or a Republican in that state. Because if I'm in Utah, I know, and I'm a Republican, I know that I could go vote and a Republican will get elected. Or I could not go vote and a Republican will get elected. And the same for the Democrats. I know that if I go vote, the Republican's still going to get elected. And if I know if I don't go vote, right? So there's incentives for both partisans not to vote. And so one thing in thinking about the election and thinking, okay, how would national popular vote change that? Well, it would mean that, you know, they're counting all the votes in all of the states, and therefore, if I'm in Utah, my vote does matter to that outcome. And so that seems to me to affect the cost and benefit of somebody who's thinking about voting. Suddenly, the benefits of voting are increased, right? And the costs of voting are the same. That doesn't change at all. But the benefits are increasing because my vote is going to influence the election outcome. And so, you know, you wonder about all of these states down here. I mean, Texas only 54.4%. That's a big state. That's a big Republican state. How many more Republicans are
Well,
going to
wasn't
turn
it
out in
listed
that
as
state?
not a Republican state, a marginal state on your slide there?
Which one?
On your first slide, the marginal or something?
Oh, it's not a battleground state.
Yeah, but it was a marginal. Yeah.
Texas? In
On
92.
your slide, yeah.
In 92. I don't know why it was in 92. Marginal.
Or about that,
Yeah, that doesn't. Bush run? That's Republican. Okay.
But there's several small states that depart from your logic as well. Wyoming, the Dakotas, and so forth are highly partisan in one direction, and yet they're higher than New Mexico in turnout.
You know, a lot of turnout is driven by demographics. So a lot of reasons why education is the biggest predictor of turnout at sort of an individual level. So there's going to be variation within that, just based on characteristics of what states look like, what their population looks like, what their minority population looks like, how educated they are, how much income they have. All of those factors are related to turnout. We're not controlling for any of that here. I'm just trying to think about how these states, you know, how that would affect the cost benefits. And it seems to me that that would be also important to down ballot races. And I think that could be important too, because if I'm a Republican in New York, right, and that's a Democratic state, and I go, well, you know, what's the purpose of going to vote in the presidential election? I know how it's going to come out, but there is a purpose to go vote, because you're not only voting for the presidential election, you're also voting for all of these down ballot races. And once you get to a local level, you know, you can get more competitive on a party level, and so that may matter more. You know, all those people turning out could have an effect on down ballot races too.
Well, Lonnie, you might ask Maggie to comment on that. We recently had a discussion about ballot placement and down ballot turnout, and I think in pretty much every county we found that, and this is a problem, when voters hit the judicial retention.
Yeah.
Now, why is that? Because they don't know them. They don't understand that office, and they don't feel educated enough to make a choice, in my opinion.
I think that's one reason.
And
lack of information, no party cues. Everything else on the ballot has party cues.
And the problem, the one problem I see with national popular vote, I'm not opposed to national popular vote under a constitutional type amendment. I'm really not. I don't agree with the compact. But one of the problems I see with that is, as a voter, how well do you know that candidate? This is why our system was set up as I read it, in a representative type system. And I'm not saying that that's working well now, because we've grown so big, we're beyond that. But initially, I think the idea was that you would elect somebody that would have a greater knowledge of that individual. You know, right now, what do we know about a presidential candidate as an average voter? We know what the media gives us, we know what the campaign gives us, and what research we might be able to delve into on our own. Has that turned out to be false on many occasions? I mean, our own judicial candidates right now are showing that to be a problem. You know, I just see that it would be, I think it would be great to have a national popular vote if there was a way for each person to actually meet and get a feel for that candidate. Is that ever going to happen? No, because it's too grand a scale. And you know, that's just something to put in your back of your mind, is how, if you want a popular vote, that's great, but it's a popularity contest then, and it becomes influenced by what are the great influences, how much money they spend, how well they conduct their campaign. It doesn't necessarily come down to who's the best qualified candidate.
So are you supporting a system? Go ahead, Maggie.
At this point, thank you, Maggie.
I think that's a problem for campaigns in general, though, and I think that says more about campaigns than it does about how we elect people. I mean, because I don't think we would want to make voting for Congress or voting for Senate or any other race less democratic at this point, or maybe better said, to put up some sort of barrier or some sort of intermediary body in between the voters and those offices. And I mean, I don't necessarily think the average New Mexican voter gets to meet their candidate for U.S. Senate. I mean, it's more possible, I guess. But I guess I think what you're saying is a really fair criticism of national elections in general and the campaign process. So I share that view with you. I'm just not sure that whether we keep the Electoral College or implement National Popular Vote Initiative compact really has anything to do with that aspect of the process, or the fact that voters don't have enough information, or that the information we get is prepackaged and glossy, you know, BS. You know, I don't necessarily know that would be less of a problem or more of a problem if we went to a different system of voting. So I mean, that's just my 2 cents, but I do share that criticism.
Back when it was originally created, I agree with you, the papers say that they didn't believe the average citizen had any means to get educated. Today, every word every candidate says is recorded and broadcast in some manner. So it's up to each individual voter. You can find out as much as you want to know and much more if you do the research. Now, I agree, most people make their decisions very superficially on a few ads they see. But the information is there, and it's there like it has never been before.
Okay, effective NPV on voters. I think the case of Nebraska is a really interesting one. So what I want to think here is about this more campaign issue. How would the campaigns change if we were to move to a national popular vote, and whether we did that through a compact or through a constitutional amendment? You know, how would that affect what happens? In some ways, it seems to me that Nebraska is a really good case in point because they have a different kind of system, and the fact that it became competitive there suddenly in this, you know, very small area for that one electoral college vote, the campaigns were in there trying to obtain, you know, win that district. So what, you know, how would we see that urban? How would we? Because this is something that's come up numerous times. How would the campaign change from a battleground state if you had a national popular vote? I mean, who would be the new battleground states? Because that's a concern you have. How would that affect that change? I mean, who do you see as the new, as the new ones? Let me pass this out too.
Well,
So how do you see that? Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I mean, are you talking about it in terms of new battleground states, or are you talking about in
New
terms of
battleground
new
areas.
battleground frontiers? Well,
Yes.
it may not even be areas. I mean, and I think, although I can't remember, Kim may be talking about this, but there may be more of a national, like, interest groups, rather the wrong term, but ethnic groups at a national level as opposed to at a county or a state level. So it's new frontiers in terms of who the candidates are going to have to start appealing to, right? So it's no longer a battleground state
It's
issue,
no longer a state.
it's a battleground frontier. What is that new frontier?
What does it look like? Yeah.
I think it would be the states that have the highest turnouts. I think that they would ignore, I think that they would still focus on who the voters are, regardless of what state they're in, who actually goes to the polls, and they would focus on states that historically get people to the polls. And do you not think? I think that they would have the attitude that people don't vote, and no matter how we change this, they're not going to vote. And that they would still be marketing to certain groups.
So would they be doing that nationally?
Maybe so, but they're gonna be marketing to the people that are more likely to go to the polls.
We were talking to Gloria earlier
Who has an issue?
that blacks in the United States may represent 15% of the country, but there's no state where they make a big difference. But now you can start to specifically market to ethnic groups like blacks nationally, which might make a difference, and their turnout, their vote does count in a Georgia, which we know is going to be Republican in general. Their vote does make a difference, and now you can target their campaigning to these ethnic groups in a way that hadn't made any difference before.
Can I comment? Yeah, so in response to that states with turnout, I mean, there is a lot of evidence that campaigns are mobilizing. So you could look at a state like Texas, which only has 54% turnout, and say there's 40% more Republicans to get to vote. You know, I'm missing half of the Republican voter population. So you might actually target, you know, I think Texas would be targeted by the
So
Republican
population, California, Texas?
Party. Yeah, I mean, I think that they would
Democrats
become,
would do California.
yeah, Democrats would target California, and Republicans Texas.
I thought about that too, but then I thought, I fear there just would still be the attitude that, boy, you know, we know we can count on, we're gonna go to Minnesota. I fear that the states that have behaved well in their voting practices, because they have high turnout, would still get some, I fear there'd be a shift, they'd get a lot more attention. Because now it's not, regardless of your voter turnout, that's not making you a battleground state. And so I just wonder, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking about it the wrong way. But I could see both sides, that just the high populace would get.
Well, it's sort of interesting because you have to, I mean, I think you do have to think some sort of a national campaign combined with where are my voters? Where are my voters? And I don't know how that would do for a tit for tat and opponent strategy and stuff like that. But this is like 2004 data. Kerry got, which you know was a closer race. Well, certainly in 2008. And that's, I wanted to have a close race to think about this. So, you know, Kerry's margin in California was 1.2 million voters. But Bush easily made up that margin by looking at those Republican states right there, right? And so, actually outbeat it. And didn't quite get the same amount of electoral college votes, right, with those fewer. So here's the margin, right? But all those votes went to Kerry. Here's all of these votes, which are actually more than these votes, and they went to Bush, and there's less of them. So that would actually count more, right, in a national popular vote system. You have all these, you know, states which have different partisan alignments, and you have to focus somehow on those voters. I mean, just like how did Bush win Ohio in 2004? Did he go to Cleveland? No. He went to the rural areas. He campaigned in the rural areas. I talked to the people in New Mexico in 2004, the Republican campaign strategists and stuff like that. You know, they had all these great stuff they showed me. You know, look how Karl Rove had our state on. It was really impressive. And where did they go? Where did they win? If you look at that data, where did they win? They won because of the rural areas of New Mexico, because they mobilized those people and got them out and got them to the polls. So it wouldn't be like an urban-rural split. It wouldn't be like, oh, we can't do, they went to their voters. They found their voters and they said, we got to get you to the polls. And they won. I mean, the Bush strategy in 2004 was to not let those rural voters alone, to make sure that those lower dense populated areas got a lot of attention and were mobilized. I mean, that's how he won Ohio, that's how he won New Mexico. Yeah.
How do we think that independence would affect that comparison with the national population? I don't know that I know the answer to that.
I know.
What is it? I mean, if you think they want to try to get those independent voters, so are they going to tend to go where they're allowed them?
You know, like if you're a Democrat in New Mexico, you focus on your base and you say, I just got to turn out my base. If you're a Republican in New Mexico and you're running statewide, you say, I've got to deal with those independent voters. I've got to bring those independent voters in because you don't have enough in your base you only have a third in your base. And so you have to say, I'm going to go after those other voters. So I think that campaigns vary how they do this, but mostly campaigns focus on their voters. Because independents are, they don't know. They focus on getting there because they know how they're, or they think they know. Obviously, it's not true in New Mexico, they got to be careful about that. But they think they know how their voters are going to vote, and so they turn them out. That's the reliable vote. That's where they focus their attention. Independents get less mail, they're less interested individuals, they're less active in political campaigns. So I'm not sure. My guess is that it would be, they're going to go for their voters based upon what they do now. Because those are the reliable voters. We have like a radio or something, put on hold. Yeah. I mean, there's got to be people in here who know a lot about campaigning, right? I mean, is there somebody who knows? Paul, you know?
What's the question?
What are you asking about?
Well, how would it change? So Paul's question is, how would it change focus on independence if you had a national popular vote plan?
Well, I think maybe even more than already is the case, you might see a move by the candidates to move to the mushy middle, if that's where independents are. But that would just be a messaging. That would be a messaging tactic. It wouldn't necessarily be, or strategy. It wouldn't necessarily be a. That wouldn't necessarily change their tactic.
Meaning it wouldn't translate into necessarily what their policies are?
Yeah, meaning that, even more than already happens in the general election, you might even see a greater move towards the middle. But I bet, it's so hard, there's so many other factors to consider when we're talking about this stuff. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. Are independents the swing voters in this election, and what are the issues that are, you know what I mean? It's going to just totally depend. I think it's a safe assumption that independents are always swing voters, but are they going to be enough of a margin, I guess, is the question, right? So, I don't know.
They tend to decide late, and they're late deciders anyway. In the campaign too, they're the ones that so maybe they are, and then they tend to go with who's winning. Do you want to address that at all?
I don't see much of a change until you go through an election. You're going to have people that will try to game it out before, but just like we're doing now, they'll dissect the numbers after an election and they'll figure it out for the next one. But, some of the Republican voters, sure, they're in rural areas, but they're also in cities. A lot of it is just getting the vote out.
Yeah.
Plain old getting the vote out kind of stuff. That's what wins elections. We sweat the weather. We sweat a lot of things on election day, but it's not even election day anymore, and it's election season. And remember, we have early voting and absentee voting, and there's all that stuff. So election day is almost meaningless to us now. If you haven't won an election, usually a month before the election day, you probably lost. So you have to look at a longer period of time than just election day. But we go chase independent voters. Everybody's always chasing independent voters. So I don't know that you would do anything different. But I guess if you're aggregating everybody, and Maggie's brought this up a number of times, what is a state as a convenient unit run a campaign. So are you gonna run in a region? Are you gonna cross state lines? You know, because you look at eastern New Mexico and West Texas, are you gonna, you know, you gonna focus on that area? What are you gonna do? So you have to figure out what your unit of organization would be for a campaign. And I don't think you can do anything other than the state that makes sense right now. You may be able to dissect the numbers and say, well, we're gonna do a 3-state region, but it's still gonna be down to the state. And I don't think, you know, would you follow area codes? I don't know. Would you follow zip codes? I just don't know what you would do to do things any different the first time around. You're still chasing the same voters as you can.
So how would that affect would there be a national campaign? How would that affect New Mexico?
Well, my personal feeling, I mean, we're the 5th largest state by land mass. It's hard to get around this place, so you know, you're not gonna have people barnstorming New Mexico in a good year. You get people to some of the population centers. But my concern is just knowing those, the folks at RNC, they're gonna be less inclined to give us money if we're not as relevant. And that's just the way it is. And money's not the whole thing, but it does help us, as I said before, build a party and do all the other things that help the down ballot votes, get out the vote, registration, and all those kinds of things. So if we're less relevant, if they perceive us as being less relevant, they'll send the money somewhere else. Remember, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people here, you know, like baby birds, advocating for, you know, getting as much money here as possible. Well, there's 10 people in every state doing that as well, trying to get money. There's a finite amount of that to go around. So, you know, if we are ever perceived as being weak, disorganized, irrelevant, not a player or whatever, then the money's just not going to come. It's a reality of at least our party system.
And so does the Electoral College affect that at all, as long as we're a battleground state?
Oh, yeah.
So as long as we're a battleground
We
state.
routinely hear that our 5 little electoral college votes are important.
Yeah, at least right
And
now.
when it's close, it's close. You need everyone that you can get to make, really game it all out. And, you know, that makes us relevant.
There's still, though, even in the, I'm sorry.
His statement that voting is no longer one day, and it is now spread over a period of time. I think that's such an important point that we have to address, and I mentioned this at the last meeting too, in that there are initiatives that are really trying to make voting a one-day activity, to get rid of early voting, to close down voting on Sundays, to shorten the hours, actual initiatives so that it's law. And if, in fact, it is who actually goes to the polls and pulls the handle, that's really an important point.
So what is the outcome of that for the Electoral College and the?
Well, I believe that means that there will be fewer people and a lesser number of certain groups of people who will actually make it to the polls to cast a vote. And so that has an effect on the national popular vote.
In southern New Mexico, I live in a colonia, it's about 25 miles from here. And I was talking to a student that had been recruited by the Obama campaign to come and get votes in Anthony, New Mexico. He doesn't speak Spanish. And I'm saying, what are they thinking? He says, I don't know how I got Anthony. I don't speak Spanish. And I call people up